the biggest contributor to lower brain reserve, which just a smaller brain decreases the buffer you have available, makes it more likely that you'll lose significant function over time, is energy status.
This is the Home of Healthspan podcast, where we profile health and wellness role models, sharing their stories and the tools, practices, and routines they use to live a lively life. Dr. Tommy Wood, it is a pleasure to have you on the Home of Healthspan today, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. But before we jump in to you, your background, and all the work you're doing, how would you describe yourself?
I'm going to go off piece just for a second and say that one of the important things that I think we can all do is diversify the things that we identify with. But I'm just going to give you one because that's what you asked for. So I am a lively professional nerd.
I very much agree. I wrote a blog post on no more labels and these are things that I do and that may change with time, but I'm not any one of these things. So I very much sympathize and empathize with that line of thinking. And I have to say, you are probably the single longest time coming guest on the show, though you probably didn't realize it. The very first episode I ever recorded was with, I believe, a friend of yours, Greg Bennett. Yeah. And he said, "Oh, you have to get Dr. Tommy Wood on the show. He's my Huberman. You got to get this guy." And it wasn't until recently when Dr. Dan Party was on and he mentioned you. I was like, "Oh, well, let me ask for this intro." And so I'm incredibly grateful that you came on. And if people look up pictures of you and see some of the physical things like your work with Formula One and others, they'll probably think a lot around physical performance, physical health. But your expertise is really around brain health. And that gets me excited because there's so many people, what's easy to see is the physical health. But there's so many people that come to me and say, honestly, I'm much more worried about my long-term brain health because so many people have personal stories from family members. And once you lose that, it's one, probably impossible to hold on to the physical health, but two, it doesn't really mean anything anyway. So can you talk a little bit about what drew you into this space in the first place?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, first of all, I'm very appreciative of both Greg and Dan for recommending me. They're both very good friends of mine and excellent guests for you to have had on your show, and hopefully everybody's listened to their episodes. So where I've ended up in the world of brain health, to be honest, it is kind of it wasn't planned at all. And actually, I've never really had any kind of plan for my career, which is why my CV is eclectic, I'm told. By the sort of formal people who have to assess those things at the university. But I certainly started more interested in physical health, particularly for myself. So I was a very sedentary kid and teenager, and then sort of found exercise kind of in my late teens. And when I was at university, a minor undergraduate degree, I was at Cambridge, and I probably spent more time rowing than I did studying, or at least it was a close call, which I did more of. I was kind of learning about training, learning about diets, just like all these different aspects were sort of became very interesting to me. And for that reason, I then went to medical school. And at the time, I was kind of like, I've learned all these things about physical health. I would like to help others with those things. As a doctor in the traditional medical care system, that's not necessarily something you have a lot of time to address, but that was my sort of initial motivation. And I continued to row when I was at Oxford. So rowing was my sport for 7 or 8 years. I also then later became head coach of the medical school boat club at Oxford. And we had some, particularly on the women's side, the women's crew, the top women's crew was kind of my main crew. And we had some very high level rowers, like rowers who'd competed sort of at an international level. So it was really cool to get to work with really talented athletes. And so then I went and worked as a doctor for a few years and didn't really know what I wanted to specialize in. So I was offered a position to do a PhD at the University of Oslo in Norway by a former mentor of mine. I'd done a little bit of work in her lab for a couple of summers when I was an undergrad. And I didn't really know what else to do. So I was like, yeah, that sounds interesting. Let's go move to Norway. And so then that was where my kind of neuroscience training started. But that sort of like formal basic neuroscience is in animal models in the lab. It was in neonatal brain injury. So not necessarily directly connected to sort of like the bigger picture of brain health. Although once you spend a lot of time in it, you can kind of see that those people who experience issues early in life, right, that changes the trajectory of your entire kind of brain health span, right? So all of this stuff integrates over time. And I think that's something that we lose a lot of in some of the formal neurology and neuroscience fields, is that you have one brain and it's influenced by your entire life. But equally, you have the opportunity to influence it wherever you are currently, right? So you don't necessarily have to worry about what happened before. You can still make positive impact right now. But while I was working on my PhD, I then got a chance to return to some of those other interests. So I started a blog and a podcast. And this is before, lots of people had podcasts. This is like 2012 or something. And I can't say it was a very good podcast. It was just like me trying to figure stuff out. But, kind of the first forays into that sphere. And I then got connected with a company that was working with athletes to support their overall health and performance. Particularly, a lot of masters athletes, people trying to juggle very high levels of performance with families and jobs and all that kind of stuff. And through that work, I got sort of connected with a group or company that does a lot of work in Formula One. So for the past nearly 10 years, I've been doing a lot of work with Formula One drivers on various aspects of cognitive and physical performance. And so I've had these two tracks in parallel in my career. One is like the formal, basic academic neuroscientist, right? I write grant proposals. We do animal models of brain injuries. We try and develop new therapies. And then the other parallel track is, working with high level performers. I've worked as a health coach for a couple of different companies, as well as, as a sort of performance consultant in professional sports. And then what's sort of quite nice about being an academic, especially in the US, actually, is that you can kind of do whatever you want as long as you can find somebody to pay you for it. So those two worlds have sort of merged over time. So now my work, as much as possible, and with lots of help and collaborators and colleagues and lots of people who work in my lab to kind of keep the wheels turning, it's now sort of like, how can we look at brain health across the entire lifespan, from right at the beginning of life through midlife and other things that might happen, lifestyle, the environment, brain injuries, so concussions and things like that, because that's important to me because some of the military and athlete work that I do. And then like, how can we keep that brain healthy for as long as possible, ideally 8, 9, 10 decades into the future, with by understanding where they are now and putting in place different things that might be able to support that process.
There are kind of two specific questions I want to jump in before we go elsewhere. But one thing you brought up is it's over the course of your entire lifetime influencing brain health. And I imagine it's actually more than your lifetime, right? So decisions and behaviors of parents, both the father and the mother, are also going to impact that. And so probably you can't do anything once you're out, like you can't influence that. But as someone who might become a parent, there's certain things you can do. And so is that part of the research too, of like, hey, over the course of my lifetime, as I'm setting up the next generation, here are things I should be looking at, avoiding or doing. Like I saw, I think Rhonda Patrick just recently put out something that the fitness levels of fathers actually carries over to the next generation. At some level, like on an epigenetic level.
So yes, that's absolutely the case. So one thing that's kind of big in the fields that I work in is the developmental origins of health and disease, DOHAD. That includes like the in utero environment, and so the mother's environment, but then also the parents even before conception does play a role. The environment that they're in and other lifestyle factors. When you get into that, though, it becomes tricky because the idea isn't to generate blame, right? Which is often the way that those kinds of things are interpreted. So you're absolutely right that the health and the environment of the parents and the mother in utero and the kid in utero do change or influence later trajectory and later health. A lot of that is kind of like big societal stressor stuff that the individuals don't even necessarily have control over. That's probably where the biggest impacts are. But yes, things like physical fitness, nutrient status, those are going to to have an impact. But luckily, I think all the evidence that we have suggests that regardless of prior environments, and so a lot of the work that I do is in babies born preterm. And so babies born preterm, when they become adults, they tend to have higher mortality risk. They have a higher risk for all of the diseases of aging. They have a higher dementia risk, on average cognitive function, maybe slightly lower. But we know the things that we can do to intervene even much, much later in life. So yes, early life trajectory can be set by all those things, but that doesn't mean that you can't shift that trajectory later on.
Actually, let's jump straight to that, because I think that's where people are going to get most bang for their buck, right? Learning from you, expert in this, because I forget the exact phrasing, but it's like the genetics can kind of dictate some of your starting point, but they're not destiny, right? You can influence so much. And I think this is where your upcoming book, The Simulated Mind, and the work you're doing and working with the best of the best, but then bringing it down to everybody, like giving everybody to access to this knowledge that you're capturing. What are those things? And I know, like the 3S model, what are those things that are in our control that we should be thinking about in relative prioritization?
What's interesting, particularly for like the genetics versus the environment thing, and you're right, so like, genes load the gun and then the environment fires it, or some version of that. When you look, so let's think about what probably people are most concerned about, which is significant cognitive decline later in life, which, if it goes either long enough or fast enough, you may end up with a condition called dementia, right? You've had a significant loss of cognitive function such that you are unable to do the daily activities to take care of yourself. That's sort of the kind of the informal definition of dementia, which there are many kinds. But 70 to 90% of dementia cases are Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And we know that for those particular cases, assuming it's not familial, like caused by a single mutation Alzheimer's disease, which is much less common, like maybe 1 to 5% of cases of Alzheimer's disease. So the vast majority have a big relationship to the environment and lifestyle risk factors, which are inherently modifiable. So the majority of dementia, some people would argue, may be, if not completely preventable, you can either you can dramatically decrease your risk by doing various things that we can get into. But when you look at specific genetic risk for dementia, so the most common one is the your ApoE or apolipoprotein E genotype, which people will probably have heard of. There are 3 different types that you can have, and you get 2 different copies. And the one that's associated with increased risk is ApoE4. And if you have 1 copy of ApoE4, your risk is maybe 2 to 6 times higher for Alzheimer's disease. And if you have 2 copies, it's like 6 to 20 times, something like that. But you can also look at polygenic risk. So like all your genes and all their different polymorphisms you can use to kind of, because they combine in lots of different little ways to increase or decrease your genetic risk of dementia. And so like those kind of risk scores exist. All the evidence to date so far says that these things are just risk multipliers. They're not an absolute destiny. So if you have ApoE4, like 1 or 2 copies, then the sort of the negative effect of being sedentary or having poor cardiovascular health or consuming relatively large amounts of alcohol, those risks are multiplied. But in the absence of those risks, you probably don't have much of an increased risk of dementia, if that makes sense. So the same things apply. It's just that for those people, there may be a bigger risk associated with them. So what that tells me is that yes, genes are important, but the core things that you need to do and think about are the same regardless of your genetics, and regardless of your genetics, you will still benefit from them. So, and I like that because that's kind of like a positive message.
Yeah, I mean, that's certain people like to say, oh, well, this person lived this long, like they were a smoker, they did this. Like, okay, great. Like they had some genetic thing that did not make it super risky for them to do that. But we know from millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, that it is going to increase your risk. And without knowing on the front end, if you're one of those people that just has a free ticket, you're probably better off. Like, even if you don't know your ApoE status, like these are behaviors that you're going to be well served to follow through with anyway, right? Just taking care of your health.
Yeah, and again, there's a few different ways that these discussions are important, because often I'll go out there and I'll say physical activity is really important for dementia prevention, right? And then somebody will say, well, my granddad played tennis every day. He was super active. He walked all the time, and he still got dementia. I'm like, I'm absolutely true, right? Physical activity is not the only risk factor, but equally, he may have had better cognitive function even when he had dementia, or he may have developed it later, or there are a whole other bunch of other things that are still consistent with both of those things being true, right? But humans struggle to think in probabilities. I'm not saying that if you do all this stuff, I can guarantee you won't get dementia. Of course I can't. But I can say, based on the data we have, you might be able to reduce your risk by 50% or more, which is like a really meaningful change. So it's kind of just thinking about all those things. Humans aren't necessarily that great at doing it. We like these kind of certainty statements, but when you kind of exist in academia, you're just dealing with probabilities. Oh, and medicine is the same. So yeah, we're just trying to think about how can we stack the deck in our favor as much as possible. That's really the goal.
Okay, and so I guess especially for people listening, what are those things? Certainly mobility and exercise and fitness sounds like a big one, but can you kind of go through, hey, here are the big buckets and biggest bang for your buck, the things you can do?
Yeah, of course. I started with all the academic parts, and then like, where does the rubber meet the road? That's what we really care about, and genuinely that's what I really care about too. So you kind of alluded to it, and I think that the framework that I found most helpful for thinking about all these different things is something that I call the 3S model, and I'll go through those different components and explain what it is. But conceptually, the reason that I think this is important is because often when we think about the factors that influence our health that we might want to change, or things we might want to do. And so even if we just focus on the brain, right, not other aspects of health, although all these things are interconnected, but you might go on Instagram and you'll find a very evidence-based list of, here are 20 things you need to do for brain health. And you're like, I mean, I could maybe do one thing. Like, which do I pick?
20 means 0 for most people, right?
100%. 2 means 0 for most people. This is why I think just having a framework that we can kind of focus on helps a lot. We can really distill it down. And also because when you change one thing, you're actually changing multiple things at the same time, which you can only really understand if you think about them as like an interconnected network rather than as a list. So the 3S model, the 3S is our stimulus, supply, and support. And the more kind of time I've spent in this field, and there's a lot of work I do with a very good colleague of mine, Dr. Josh Turknet, who's a neurologist, and we've written sort of papers on this idea. And part of it is influenced by the fact that I'm a bit of a meathead at heart. I like to lift weights and that kind of stuff. And I've competed in lots of different types of sports. So this is the framework that kind of helps me understand it. And it's very related to that physical side that we kind of touched upon. So I believe, and I think we have good evidence to support the idea that the primary determinant of brain function is the stimulus that is applied to that brain. And I'll make that clearer, I promise. But to kind of draw the parallel, if you want bigger biceps, which is an admirable goal that I recommend everybody have, if you want bigger biceps, and if that's not a goal you have, that's of course fine. But if you want bigger biceps, you need to lift weights. You need to do bicep curls, right? You need to apply a stimulus to that tissue. Mechanical tension is the primary driver of muscle growth. If you eat enough protein and you have good nutrient status and you sleep well, you will get more adaptation for a given stimulus, right? So you can support the response to that stimulus, but you can't just chug protein shakes and nap and hope that your biceps will get bigger, right? You have to go and do some bicep curls. And that's the same for cardiovascular fitness. It's the same for the immune system being exposed to vaccines or viruses. It's the same as like the liver metabolizing alcohol. It's the same as bones becoming stronger under load. basically any function of the body is largely driven by the stimulus that's applied to it, because the body adapts to those stimuli by improving function. That's how we survive in the world as we do. So all of this to say that the brain seems to be the same. So if we're thinking about any of the sort of basic cognitive functions that we might care about, memory, processing speed, executive function, sort of decision making, focus and attention, having an actual stimulus that we apply to our brains to expand these capacities is the primary determinant of having those capacities in the first place. And so that's why stimulus is, I think, the most important part of the 3S model, because you need the stimulus for the brain to then adapt and improve in response. So stimuli that seem to be really beneficial are, early in life, there's just an endless amount of evidence to support that greater education and greater educational attainment is one of the primary drivers of cognitive development and, cognitive function. But anything that involves learning and skill development, which by design also requires you to actively engage the processes of focused attention, processing information, memorizing skills, you're driving sort of non-specifically and specifically, you're driving these functions in the brain by engaging with skill learning more broadly. So that can be various kinds of social interaction, that can be languages, music, dancing, any kind of complex movement. These are kind of core human skills that seem to drive brain function.
If anyone wants some good examples on that, my mom, in her 60s started studying Spanish, then 70s added on Italian, but then had like a physical injury. And I think the best thing that's going to be for her to stave off dementia, she started learning to play golf left-handed. So her whole life played right-handed, and now she can't play right-handed. So she switched to left-handed. And like all the biomechanics and having to rewire the brain, I'm like, that's going to be the best thing you possibly do.
Yeah, absolutely. And because like not only are you stimulating multiple brain networks at the same time, but you're engaging the processes of memory, attention, focus, decision making, all at the same time. And it's these things that really drive the function in those, in those areas of the brain. And those are networks in the brain that are sort of susceptible to the processes of aging, and that accelerates as people sort of enter into a trajectory towards dementia. So that's the stimulus bucket. So then the next one that I talk about is supply. So if you think about, you've stimulated a network in the brain, where you've activated all these different parts of the motor cortex and maybe like visual-motor coordination as you try and learn how to play golf left-handed, right? So those parts of the brain, as they become active, they increase their requirement of resources. And there's this thing called neurovascular coupling, which is basically as those neurons fire, and then some of the other cells in the brain that support neurons, like astrocytes, their activity dilates the blood vessels, right? So expands the blood vessels in those areas of the brain to draw in more oxygen, more like energy, right? Generally as glucose, but it can be other things like lactate and ketones. And then nutrients that are required to, create new synapses and new mitochondria and all those kinds of things that then cement those processes as you adapt to that stimulus. So that tells us we need good cardiovascular health, because we need our blood vessels to be healthy. And we know that the majority of cases of dementia have some issue with the blood vessels in the brain, endothelial dysfunction or small clots or that kind of stuff. So this is where risk factors for cardiovascular disease tie very closely to risk factors for dementia. We also need good metabolic health to be able to supply energy and use that energy. So that's where, avoiding things like prediabetes, high blood pressure, which also links to the cardiovascular side, are really important. And then we need adequate nutrient status so that we can build those different parts of the brain that are required. So nutrients that we know are really critical are things like long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA, which concentrates in synapses in the brain. B vitamins, particularly the B vitamins that affect methylation, because methylation is required to get that DHA into the membrane so it can do its job. But also vitamin D, iron, magnesium, those are like probably some of the heavy hitters, because magnesium and some other things like zinc, really important for like neuromodulation, right? They help to kind of tune some of the signals in the brain. But other things become important as well, like antioxidant status. And there are some like polyphenols that you get in berries and chocolate and tea and coffee and that kind of stuff seem to be really closely tied to how well you can continue to run the cognitive machinery for decades, right? Because it generates some oxidative stress and they can sort of help modulate that process. So that's the kind of supply bucket. And then the final bucket is support. In the kind of this process, right, you've activated the brain, you've supplied all these different things that it needs to respond, then there's this period of adaptation where function improves. So any good athlete knows that you don't get stronger in the gym, you get stronger when you're recovering afterwards. And the brain is essentially the same. And sleep is obviously the time when that happens for the majority of it, though defined low activity periods during the day after periods of intense cognitive activity can be really important for sort of like shorter term recovery. And you see that in kind of studies of how people feel and perform during the workday. So there is some aspect of rest and recovery that's important within a day as well as after a day. So sleep is really critical. But then you also want to avoid things that impair that recovery process. So chronic stress is one of those. It creates this sort of hypermetabolic, greater demands in the brain so that you can never actually fully recover and adapt from those stimuli that you're receiving. And so, finding ways to address those, if that's a risk factor for you, that's important. Then other things that might impair that process include, smoking, air pollution, significant intake of alcohol. So it's all of that. It's how you are creating the environment that allows for adaptation to stimulus. And then there are other things that kind of fit into that, including like trophic support. So we know that there are lots of hormones and proteins that your body produces that help to support those adaptation processes. They can be generated by exercise, or they might be hormonal status or some other things that might change over time. So those are kind of the three buckets. And then I talk about how they interact, because when you change one thing, like I said earlier, you can change many of them. So if you sleep more, we know that the next day you are more likely to feel sociable. So you're more likely to socially interact with other people and therefore get more stimulus. We also know that your blood pressure will improve and your blood sugar will improve. We know you're more likely to pick a nourishing meal rather than just reach for something that sort of like satisfies you in the minute, but like is not necessarily supporting some of those other processes. The same if you exercise more, then right, you've created some stimulus, but you also sleep better and all these other things. So that's why you can kind of look at the network and say, like, here's one area where I think I can get the biggest bang for my buck. And then when you start to pull that lever, the whole kind of network shifts in your favor. And then it's not as daunting a list of things to try and address.
Most corporate wellness programs overwhelm employees with too much, or they offer too little to be useful. Alively gets it right. We start with each employee's data and goals, then serve one clear, personalized action at a time. No noise, just real behavioral change. The outcome? A healthier, happier workforce, and measurable impact for your business. Visit alively.com to see personalized wellness in action.
This may be a winding question, so please have patience with me while I try to get there, because this idea of overstimulation, it made sense in the physical side, right? People talk about being overtrained. And I think it was Andy Galpin in his Perform podcast had one of like, realistically, the average person is not possible they can get overtrained. Like you look at what professional athletes do, the amount of hours, the loads they're putting on, the average person can't be overtrained. And I'd look at my own HRV and the stuff I'm doing and said, I don't know. It's hard to buy that. Like I used to be on the national team for swimming. I used to do 5-6 hours a day of swimming. Like I know my body could take that, but now as someone who's getting up early to take care of my daughter and then working all day, like you're under different stressors. And so maybe in an absolute perfect world, you couldn't get overtrained, but you could be under rested, under recovered for the training load you're doing. And so I'm curious what that looks like for stimulation on the brain, because could it, does it cause the same kind of, it will run you down like you can physically, or is it just you're unproductive, or it's just not sinking in, you're not learning? Like you can put more hours in simulation on, but it's just like water off a duck's back. Like what does it look like on the mind side?
That's a really great question. I think coming back to the physical side, and the same is the case for the brain, right? That rather than thinking about just the one stimulus, which is the training stimulus, we have to think about all the stimuli, all the stresses that an individual is exposed to. And the adaptation that we're driving, right? Any adaptation, be it to a physical or cognitive stimulus, is right. The initial response is some version of the stress response, right? Sympathetic activation increases, cortisol increases, right? This is our generalized response to anything that our body determines to be important, and that includes a training session. That includes going to school and having to focus, right? So then, a useful framework is the idea of allostatic load, which Bruce McEwen developed, which is essentially thinking about what's the totality of things that you're having to respond to versus the totality of your ability to adapt and recover. So if your training load might have decreased, but your other stresses may have increased, and they can be both on the cognitive side as well as decreasing your ability to recover if you're skipping sleep because you have to go do stuff with your family and whatever. So in the sports science world, yes, it's a very interesting intellectual question to say, is this overtraining or is it under recovery? Practically speaking, for the individual, they're two sides of the same coin, right? If you're doing more of one, you have less time for the other. That's just across all spheres of your life. So in terms of the brain, I like the fact that you brought up this comparison, because I like to think of everybody, actually, regardless of their job, as cognitive athletes. And because the word athlete comes from the ancient Greek meaning to compete for a prize. So if your prize is, I get my brain to work for 90 years, right? Then that's something that we're all striving for, right? Regardless of our day-to-day job or work or whatever. So you're right that when I sort of present this framework of stimulus, I think that we are simultaneously understimulated and overstimulated at the same time. So we are understimulated from this, skill learning, social interaction, core processes that drive cognitive function, in humans that we have very good evidence for. We do less of that because we have so many other concerns and things that we have to deal with. And then within a given day, right? So anybody can sort of identify with this, right? You get up, and then you've got to get all the kids to school and get ready for work and whatever. So you're not really thinking about stuff. It's just you're surviving for an hour or two, and then you get to work, and then there's just emails you have to deal with, and then you're in meetings all day. And while you're in meetings, you're probably multitasking because you're answering emails, and maybe you're checking Instagram because this meeting was particularly boring, and you're constantly task switching. Right. So you get to the end of the day and you haven't actually done any work, right? How often have you spent a day at work and not actually done any work? And it happens to be all the time because of the modern work environment. And so across all of that, not only are you not spending time actively engaging your brain in these processes, right? You're not doing a focused training session. You're just doing what we might call junk volume. It's just you're running all day with no specific purpose. But then there's also the fact that you never got a chance to recover from this, what we would call cognitive middle gear. And I can talk about the cognitive gears, kind of expand on that framework. But there's cognitive middle gear work that's very stressful for all these different reasons, right? You're constantly task switching. It's a greater mental burden for less total output. You're stressed about the fact that you're not actually getting any work done, and you never get a chance to take a break. So we're kind of constantly overstimulated from that standpoint. Plus, then we go home and maybe we're doing the same thing. So we're watching TV, but we're also looking at our phones and all these other, right? We're never getting these true mental breaks. So what we're missing is really good quality focused stimulus, and we're missing good quality recovery because we're spending all this kind of time in the middle. So if you've ever worked with amateur athletes, which I have done a lot of, what they often assume, because they're amateurs, right? They're not professionals. Like, this isn't their job. They're kind of doing it on the side. What they assume is that the thing that's missing from their performance is that they're not spending enough time training. So they will just go out, maybe even multiple times or multiple hours a day. And it's just like, it's hard all the time. They're like, I just have to push harder. If I push harder, I'll get better. And what happens is they get stress fractures and they get injuries and their body never has a chance to recover, but also they never drive really high quality adaptation because they're not sort of periodizing their training. And that is essentially what we're doing with our brains all day, every day.
That's a really good analogy between those two. Most of what we've talked about has been at the average, right? Like, hey, this is for the base, this is good for everyone. I'm curious, especially given some of your work, for addressing once things have gone wrong, right? Like, you've done work identifying what actually a concussion is, what's causing a concussion. And so some of the recovery, if something like that happens, or maybe you have, like we talked on ApoE4, a genetic disorder that may cause cognitive impairment and put you more at risk. What are those things once you're kind of behind the 8 ball? Is it the same behaviors, or are there certain things that you're like, hey, this could even more stack the deck once you've started behind a little bit?
I think all the evidence we have so far mainly aligns with kind of the second thing that you mentioned, which is the same behaviors still matter. So the sort of the balance of them may change slightly, but so if like concussion is a really good example. Ideally, if you're somebody who's at a high risk of head injury, you've addressed some of this stuff before, because then when the head injury occurs, you may be able to lessen its impact. And that, like nutrient status, metabolic health, some of these things can, it seems, sort of exacerbate or sort of moderate the effect of a concussion when it occurs. Some of that comes from like animal models, and then a little bit from sort of epidemiology, because we can't do randomized controlled trials of that kind of stuff. It was very, very hard to do. There are some populations where they have a very high concussion rate, so you can kind of put interventions in place beforehand, but we can't, like, sort of big multi-pronged interventions are very hard to do in that kind of scenario. So we kind of have to join the dots a little bit that way. But so say if you have a concussion, one of the most important things is, which has changed in the last few years, it's now built into most concussion recovery protocols, but is becoming physically active as soon as you can afterwards, as long as it's not making your symptoms worse, and having this sort of like graded return, first to just any kind of physical activity, and then to skill or sport specific activity, assuming that this was like a sports related concussion. So in that scenario, yes, I think there are nutritional things that you would take into account. We've written some papers on that, but the most important thing is getting that brain moving again, because that seems to be really critical to recovery. For, say, once people have started a trajectory of, they've noticed some cognitive changes, there was a recent update to the sort of the framework, the diagnostic process, or like the life course, the sort of like the formal description of the different stages of cognitive decline and dementia. They've now included subjective cognitive decline as kind of like the first step. So that being that, like, that something's different, but if you did you went to a neurologist and you did a mocker test or something like that, right? It's not going to pick anything up, because that's designed to pick up people who already have a significant deficit. But if you have some subjective changes, this is now considered something that people should think about and take seriously, which previously was very hard to do because you couldn't do a test and diagnose it, right? You're kind of relying on the patient's history and their own feeling of things that might have changed. But all the evidence suggests that those changes are probably completely reversible. If you have subjective decline, you are at an increased risk of future dementia, but not everybody who has subjective cognitive decline gets dementia. And it seems that there's a lot that you can still do, in that period of time. But then it's still going to be going back to, like, what are my most major risk factors, and how can I address those? So, like, those are all the big ticket items that we talked about earlier. Once you get further down that trajectory, it gets more and more controversial, I'll say, as to whether you can fully reverse that process. there are certainly case reports in the literature that say, even once you've had people with diagnosed with dementia, they can get the other side of that such that they're no longer, right, they can become independent again. But we're not at a point where we can say like Alzheimer's disease is reversible. But with those same interventions, physical activity, improving cardiovascular health, nutrient status, you do seem to be able to improve quality of life and function regardless of where you are on that trajectory. So I think, that's not the same as like fully reversing the disease process, but one of the reasons why I spend so much time focusing on those like core things that I mentioned earlier, that's what I built into the 3S model, is that whether you're like just leaving the neonatal intensive care unit because you're born preterm, or you're 80 years old and you have some evidence of cognitive decline, like those same things are having an effect for everybody. Or recovering from a concussion, or you're trying to improve cognitive function because you want, it's important for a high level performance. So those same things just seem to be important again and again and again.
And are there keystones within it? I mean, I think about stimulus, and the research as hearing goes that it can accelerate this. And so you're losing an important entry point to stimulus because you may check out of more conversations, you may become less sociable. So hey, look, if that's something you're starting to see, get hearing aids maybe sooner rather than later, really protect that hearing. Or on the nutrient side, I think the big thing people talk about a ton now is creatine, not just for the meatheads, but like, hey, look, for the brain health, here's one of the things that it does. Or I've heard also Alzheimer's described as type 3 diabetes, of saying, okay, well, would a GLP-1 or a SGLT2 inhibitor, like, would those things help kind of reverse, much less recent studies with lithium and all these? So I guess question on this, like once you're getting there, are there certain keystone things that you're like, hey, these small actions, or even if they're not that small, have outsized positive impact?
Yeah. So I think you can look at these at multiple levels, but the highest levels are the ones that where you see the most impact. So if we go back to the stimulus side, so you mentioned hearing aids. So like if you're experiencing hearing loss, hearing aids, absolutely. And it's something that people avoid because there's kind of some stigma attached to it. But the evidence certainly suggests, especially if you're at risk of dementia for other reasons like poor physical or cardiovascular health, there's randomized controlled trial data now to show that having hearing aids is protective. Similar evidence for cataract surgery if you have cataracts, right? Because eyesight loss is the same. Smell, like loss of smell after COVID, that was associated with change in cognitive function. But you can also retrain that, right? There's protocols to do that. So if you've lost a sense, right, that's working hard to recover that sense is important. And like some of it's like loss of direct input to the brain, but it's also the exact thing that you said, which is that you stop doing things because you've lost that sense, right? And so you're losing a whole bunch of immeasurable stimuli because of that. Then in terms of like skills, like all the things that I mentioned seem to have very similar effects. There was a very nice study published in Nature very recently that looked at creative experiences and how they affect the activity and function of different networks in the brain. Especially networks in the brain that are at risk with aging processes. And so that's like art, dance, language, music, video games, even. And so all that to say that just continuing to engage in these complex skills and continuing to learn these complex skills, and to some extent, it doesn't really matter which you pick. It's because it has to be just like one that you're going to continue to do and you're going to enjoy. So those are like the big ticket items that have an outsized effect, I think, in that bucket. And then from the nutrition side, yes, all the individual nutrients I mentioned earlier are very important. The easiest way to tackle that is to have a nutrient-dense, varied diet, which is kind of vague, but there are so many ways to skin that cat. And actually, there's very little evidence that one diet is better than another. And there are two main things you're trying to tick. And a sort of like a whole foods, nutrient-dense diet ticks these boxes most easily. One is just nutrient density, right? You're probably going to be getting more choline, omega-3s, magnesium, right? Potassium, which is really important for blood sugar regulation, more polyphenols, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's one. And then the other is you're much more likely to be able to manage your energy status. And there was a recent trial that compared the MIND diet, which is like a Mediterranean style diet specifically for cognitive function. They compared that to caloric restriction in a group of older adults. And basically both of them improved cognitive function the same amount. And that's because
one's a lot more fun.
Yeah, one's a lot more fun. Yeah, right. But the thing is that like a lot of people still I would be very happy if people ate a MIND style diet, right? But you could consider that trial to be a failure of the MIND diet because it didn't beat out like boring standard dieting, just eating less of what you're currently eating. But that's because in the modern environment, the biggest contributor to lower brain reserve, which then, it was just a smaller brain, which then decreases the buffer you have available, makes it more likely that you'll lose significant function over time, is energy status. So low energy status, which is very common in athletes actually, is associated with lower brain volumes, as is excess energy availability. So cardiovascular disease, prediabetes, metabolic disease. And so eating a sort of a varied whole foods based diet makes it harder to overeat, makes it more makes it easier to control your appetite, makes it much more likely that you'll actually have an adequate amount of energy because you have this sort of inverted U-shaped curve between like brain volume, and we want as much brain as possible, and energy status. So like too little isn't great. And so that's why I think lots of fasting and lots of caloric restriction probably not the best for your brain, as well as, too much has the same problem. So that's why just like at a big level, it's, how varied a nutrient dense diet can you consume? You're probably going to tick those boxes very easily. And then you don't have to necessarily get into the nitty gritty as much.
And then I guess on the support side, is it just, get 8 hours in bed? Like the best thing you can do is just baseline, get 8 hours in bed, and then you can worry about cooling the temperature.
Yeah, don't smoke, don't drink too much. And then, give yourself enough sleep opportunity. Like the most common cause of inadequate sleep is not spending enough time in bed. Even in elite level athletes, I've seen their sleep data and they're like, I'm really worried. I'm only getting 6 hours of sleep a night. I'm like, yeah, it's because you're spending 6.5 hours in bed. Like what? Like I can't fix that. Like there's no supplement. Yeah. There's no supplement for that.
The best recommendation I heard from one of our guests, Michael Chernow, was don't worry about your morning wake up alarm. The more important alarm is your go to bed
bedtime alarm. Yeah.
You set your bedtime alarm, and then even if you don't do it right, then at least get you in the mindset of, the better me would go to bed now.
Yeah. No, 100%. That's great. That's great advice. I think I have that as one of the ideas for like supporting sleep in my book, because I think it is a great idea, even though it feels really kooky. Most of us have to get up at a specific time, right? We got jobs, kids have stuff to do, go to school, right? That doesn't change. So the variable we can change ourselves is when we go to bed. So however we can make that as frictionless as possible, the better. But yeah, for like in the support side, honestly, the biggest ticket item is adequate sleep, and getting enough sleep opportunity is the easiest way to change that.
Well, Dr. Wood, there are a lot more questions I could and would ask, and so maybe we'll have to ask you to come back.
Yeah, of course.
But again, the book is The Stimulated Mind. Thank you so much for your work over the years, for putting all that into a book, and for coming on today and sharing all this with our listeners.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great. There may well be questions that you and the listeners have that you want to dig into more of those details. I'm always happy to come back and do that. If you can wait a few months, then a lot of that is in the book. It's available for pre-order right now. You can go to thestimulatedmind.com. Wherever you buy books, we'll sell it to you. Pre-orders are super helpful for me because then my publisher believes that somebody's going to buy the book. Even though I appreciate it's not going to be out till early next year. But in the meantime, I do have a free Substack that has a podcast that I do with my friend Josh that I mentioned earlier, which is betterbrain.fitness. And you can get a bunch of additional stuff there. And it's a question and answer format podcast. So if you disagree with or you have any additional questions based on anything I said today, you can come there, ask us questions. We can answer them on the podcast. And I'd love to see anybody there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitten. We'll make sure to put those in the show notes so people have easy access as well. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us, and enjoy a lively day.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Home of Healthspan podcast. And remember, you can always find the products, practices, and routines mentioned by today's guests, as well as many other Healthspan role models on alively.com. Enjoy a lively day.